Well, good afternoon, Florida. Hello from my virtual stage, my home. Obviously, I wish I was in person in Florida, but the new normal is being on Zoom, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Liz Schreier. I'm President and CEO of the USGLC, and I want to welcome what will be hundreds of participants from Florida in what I know is going to be a really important discussion, talking about working beyond party lines to build a better and safer world. Now, given our challenges at home and across the globe, this is going to be a timely conversation, certainly in the midst of a global pandemic where there are critical conversations across our nation on the racial and economic divide. And I think we're about 30 days before an election, and I'm pretty sure Florida is an important conversation and state. Now, I want to start where our thoughts are certainly with the President, the First Lady, all those in Florida, across the country and the globe who have been impacted by the dreaded virus, and hope everyone is safe and healthy. Many of you certainly joined us for our conversation in April when I had the opportunity to talk with Representative Donna Shalala, a powerful discussion given her expertise on global health. And we took a look at what was important about the global response that is needed in a global pandemic. Today, we're going to check in on that same conversation, but how it has moved forward. It is a unique opportunity today to have a first in USGLC history, a town hall with not one but two congresspeople in a bipartisan duo, two powerful leaders in the House of Representatives that may not agree on everything, but today I think we're going to find common ground about America's place in the world. I'm not surprised that we're having this conversation in Florida, given that you have a state that's a microcosm of the country, a bellwether of purple understanding about when it comes to the importance of America's place in the world, a footprint in the world that it is important to us in terms of our national security, our economic interests. I'm going to introduce them more formally, but I want to give them a shout out because they're in the Zoom room. Two wonderful friends of the USGLC, highly respected in foreign policy, one from each party that we have hosted individually, but I'm thrilled that they are here together, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart and Congressman Ted Deutch. Let me just set a few words about the context of our conversation. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, your host for today, is celebrating our 25th year. When I think back on 25 years ago and today, there are so many differences and unfortunately some similarities in the sense that 25 years ago, America just coming out of the Cold War, we had some fellow citizens who were thinking we should turn a little inward. We, after all, had seen ourselves as winning the Cold War, and we should have a peace dividend. Some felt we didn't need things like the State Department, USAID, Peace Corps, forgetting the dangerous lessons that we thought about after World War II. So we organized the voices that understood why we needed to be engaged in the world. And that is your host for today. We're a big tent organization known as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. What you're seeing is icons of the 500 businesses and NGOs that make up the USGLC. We're proud that we are bipartisan, an advisory committee that's the who's who of national security, with over 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals that support our work. We're in every state in the country, including Florida, with our wonderful co-chairs, Andrew Crenshaw and Alex Sink. And what we're joined together today is to talk about what makes up our mission, to build a better, safer world, to have partners engaged in the world with us because it's smart for our security, our economic interests, and our values. We advocate for the little 1% of the federal budget known as the international affairs budget that supports our diplomats, healthcare workers around the world, make sure that we're working to open up markets for our goods and services. And we support forums like what we're doing today to talk about why it's important to be engaged in the world. We don't need any greater lesson than what we're dealing with right now in the midst of a global pandemic. What a wake-up call, as we all know. So we have lots to talk about, and let's get started. And I'm so excited to introduce our honored guest. Two congressmen that are thoughtful champions of America's leadership in the world, who together have worked on some of the greatest challenges and certainly have been working hard over the last several months to make sure Floridians stay safe and secure from COVID-19. Together, they have more than 30 years of experience in Congress. Let me introduce both of them a little more formally. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, who represents the 25th District of Florida, serves on the Appropriations Committee. There he is, welcome, and previously sat on the subcommittee that oversaw international affairs programs. He is a longtime champion of the issues we're going to talk about, America Global Leadership, demonstrating that leadership by being part of several caucuses that I hope we get to talk about today, caucuses that oversee Colombia, Taiwan, and the effectiveness of foreign assistance. Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Joining him is going to be Congressman Ted Deutch, who represents the 22nd District of Florida. Welcome, Congressman. One appropriator, and the other one is on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, serving as chair of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee. And Congressman Deutch is known as an expert in many areas, including bolstering alliances, combating state fragility, and defending global human rights. Welcome, Congressman Deutch.
Thanks, Liz. Great to be with you. Great to see you, Mario.
Likewise, my friend.
So are you both healthy? Well, Congressman Diaz-Balart, you were one of the first congressmen that actually had COVID. Everybody feeling well?
Yeah, thank God, Liz. It's having COVID is not a distinction I would have liked to have had, but fortunately, totally recovered. I feel healthy, and I'm one of the blessed ones. And again, thank you for this opportunity, Liz. Thank you for your leadership. And I do want to later say some words about my dear friend and colleague, Ted Deutch, because he just happens to be one of the real class acts in public service these days.
Oh, do you want to say something back after that?
Liz, it's a bit, you've got, I know a big crowd of people anxious to get into a conversation, but suffice to say, Mario and I have a bit of a mutual admiration society. And I think it speaks volumes that a month until the general election in what is an often heated political environment, Mario and I still looking for ways to do things together on behalf of the people of the state of Florida, and looking for ways to model how it might be possible to work together in this challenging environment. And that's the kind of person Mario is, and that's why we're so glad he recovered fully, and why it's always great to appear with him.
Hear, hear. I love it. All right, well, let's get into conversation. So I have a bunch of questions, and then I'm going to bring in a few of our advisory committee members from Florida to ask both of you questions. But I'm going to start, actually, I'm going to show a video clip, and then I'm going to ask you a question on the other side. So ladies and gentlemen, take a look at this, and Congressman, watch this, and then we'll ask you a question.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
So you probably have seen that before, but that was Bill Gates, but it was 5 years ago, and I bet a whole lot of us wish we had been paying attention to him. And the truth is we're still not ready. One statistic from CDC is that 70% of the world remains unprepared to detect, respond to a pandemic. So, Ted, you're on foreign affairs, Congressman Diaz-Balart, you have been, actually a bill to strengthen USAID's health innovation. So my question to both of you is, why didn't we invest? We didn't have the political will to put the investments we needed to be prepared for a global pandemic. And what do we need to do now to make sure that we're never at this place again? Congress Diaz-Balart, why don't you start this one and then we'll switch around.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Liz. In the appropriations process, we started a few years ago looking at trying to get ready. We created 2 pots of money, one under State Foreign Ops and one under HHS, to have funding available for something like this. Just always fearing that it could happen. And so, good question is, you go back to not only that video, you go back to President George W. Bush, getting close to the beginning, actually the end of his administration, he started talking about this, and nobody really kind of paid much of attention to it after that. And so, but I'm glad that in the appropriations process, we did. And we put, again, 2 pots of money to deal with this. But obviously, we could have never foreseen the size and the scope of this pandemic. And I fear that it won't be the last one of its type. So part of it is that we kind of like chase the shiny object du jour, whatever the issue may be. And I don't want to get into what those are, but I always hear about certain issues that are in the press that you hear a lot about, which may be 30, 40, 50 years out, and we haven't focused, and we don't focus usually on things that are a little bit more real, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's fighting disease, and we have to do that globally, because as we've learned, things that happen around the world have a direct impact as to what happens here in the United States. Can we do better? Yes. I'm glad that through the appropriations process, we started doing that, which is why we had a little bit of money, actually a substantial amount of money set aside at the beginning of this pandemic. But obviously the scope and the size of this is something that Congress and the administration had to act. We did, with, again, a $3 trillion piece of legislation, bipartisan legislation. Can we be more ready? We have to be more ready. And we have to remember that that a lot of these things happen abroad. They start abroad, which is why I've always said that spending money on, call it state foreign operations, whatever you want to call it, is really national security spending, whether it's for healthcare, whether it's even for education. It's really money that we spend for our benefit, not for theirs, because we're so tied together.
Great, thanks. Congressman Deutch, what's your take on this?
Well, I agree with Mario and what's transpired until now, but I also think we all can agree that this pandemic has reminded us why it is that it's impossible for us to think that we can somehow push these issues aside and that we're not going to be affected by them. Going forward, the one thing that is so critical is that we not lull ourselves into this sense that if we can just get through this, that we'll be okay. Because as Mario points out, there's every reason to think that this won't be the last one. On the Foreign Affairs Committee, we advanced bipartisan legislation, the Global Health Security Act, that says that it's going to be the policy of the United States to promote global health as a core national security interest. That's one of the things that we've learned from this. The legislation creates an interagency council on global health with a position of global health coordinator at the National Security Council, and it requires a national strategy. We passed that in the House unanimously because members on both sides of the aisle clearly recognize how important it is that we not only be prepared, but that our allies and partners are prepared, and that we have a plan when countries are at risk, because it's not just a risk to our health, it's not just a risk to global health, it's a risk of destabilization. And just one last thing, Liz, over the past number of months, I've tried to connect with ambassadors from all around the world to hear how their countries are managing and what they want when they look to the United States is to know what the United States is going to do both domestically and internationally to ensure that that we're better prepared. That we know, look, last thing we know, China and Russia are watching with bated breath with the hopes that the United States will retreat on the global stage. And here in Florida, where we have diaspora communities from literally all across the world in our state, families traveling internationally, robust global trade, we're dependent on tourism. All of these things, I think, dictate that we not only take this seriously, but that those of us in Florida make this an urgent priority.
Absolutely. No, you can't stop a global pandemic without a global response, and your leadership has really mattered. What I'd like to do is try to, we'll get through as many questions as we can. We're getting questions already from in the chat room, and I'm going to bring in a few other people, but I'll go through as many as quickly as you can all answer. And I'm going to start with one to you. If you want to answer each other's questions, you're welcome to. Just jump in, but I'll kind of ping pong back and forth. A lot of people always say our engagement overseas is broken. So I want to start with some successes that I know you've been involved with. Congressman Diaz-Balart, I want to talk about one that you've talked about a lot, which is what's happened with Plan Colombia. That was an example where the US government, military aid, economic aid, working between Democrat and Republican administrations with the Colombia government, moved a narco-driven state to one of our biggest trading partners. But there's some challenges going on, exactly what you both were talking about, COVID causing health issues, destabilization with Venezuela. What lessons would you draw from Plan Colombia working, even though there's some challenges in the region right now? What would you have to say?
No, Liz, there clearly are challenges. I think the bottom line is that we should do what we can to help our allies and also do what we can to pressure. And that can, it takes different ways. Is it isolation? Is it pressure? Is it diplomatic, economic pressure? Our enemies, our adversaries. But you're right. I think Plan Colombia is potentially the biggest large foreign affairs success story of the United States, I don't know, since the Marshall Plan. And it was billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money to help Colombia. It was on the verge of becoming a failed narco state. And now, as you mentioned, we're the largest trading partner. It's billions of dollars. We also have a free trade deal with Colombia that was bipartisan. That took some doing, by the way. Previous administration had some concerns that we were able to work through. And so does Colombia have some challenges? Yes. By the way, we're currently helping Colombia deal with the pandemic, also with some funding, but also the fact that their next door neighbor, Venezuela, which used to be the wealthiest country in South America, is now destitute. It's the largest refugee crisis in the history of this hemisphere. Many of those refugees from Venezuela, from that dictatorial regime, have ended up going to Colombia, obviously in other countries. So Colombia has got some challenges, but I want to add to what, again, Ted and you said, Liz, that I get a lot of questions, why do we spend money abroad? And I get that because we have so many needs here. And I remind people, we do it for our national security interests. Think about what would have happened if Colombia would have collapsed into a narco state, if it would have become another Venezuela earlier on. What it would have done to the importation of illicit drugs to the United States, and who knows what else, terrorist groups, etc. And now it's a model country. They help us now in training military and judges around the world, and again, helping other struggling democracies try to get up on their feet. They're doing it now with their money. And so again, it's a huge success story, but I repeat it. All of these things that we do, whether it's healthcare abroad, whether it's national security, whether it's economic security for some of our allies, it's national security issues for the United States. Liz, at the beginning, you mentioned that it's what, about 1% of the federal budget. I think that's a pretty darn good investment in our national security, in our health security, to spend, again, about 1% of the budget on helping others be self-reliant, fighting narco-terrorism, fighting terrorism, fighting disease. And I think Colombia is one of those bright spots and examples that we can point to as to a bipartisan effort, Plan Colombia. It was years and years and years, and we had folks who were against it. But again, there you could always count on Ted Deutch always being on the forefront of fighting for not only Colombia and Plan Colombia, but fighting for our allies and making sure that we stand with our allies. But the second part of this is that we pressure and that we confront our adversaries. And that's why, again, I'm such a big fan of Ted Deutch, because this is the guy who never gets confused.
He's your biggest fan.
Well, look, I know it's not cool, particularly right before an election, to be saying good things about somebody from the other party. But again, Ted is one of those leaders that I rely on, and I never have to worry about, because I know where he stands, and he's always on the side of the angels.
I love that. I'm going to pick up on your national security point and ask Congressman Deutch, put on your national security expertise, because you chair your subcommittee deals with terrorism. And one of the dangers we've been watching around COVID-19 is exactly what Congressman Diaz-Balart was talking about, is we're seeing one of the repercussions around the instability of fragile states. I saw a statistic recently that violent attacks in sub-Saharan Africa have gone up 40% greater this now compared to this time last year. So how worried are you about what COVID is doing in terms of the destabilization impact of the pandemic? What are you seeing? What worries you?
Well, first, I gather I can't yield the rest of my time to Mario, can I? So,
you can bring him into your campaign. This is great.
But while I appreciate Mario's kind words, I want to emphasize what he said about me, because it's true about him, and it's true about, frankly, members of Congress who work best together, which is knowing where we stand and knowing what we believe in, and being able to find ways to look for common ground, especially on issues like this, and especially on when it comes to national security threats.
Yeah.
We know that terrorist groups feed on instability, Liz. We know that the pandemic causes more instability, certainly than anything we could have imagined. It causes economic collapse, and it sets us down a path that literally will take years for us to recover, certainly from the economic impact. And that's felt especially in developing countries. And so you see what happens when weak governments aren't able to provide services for their people. We see what happens when there are leadership vacuums. That's when these groups step in to try to take advantage. I would give you the example of Lebanon, actually. One of the reasons Hezbollah has been able to create this stranglehold on the political system is because they provide some basic services. They run healthcare clinics in Shia neighborhoods. Now they hold the health ministry. Hezbollah is a terrorist group, and it's a group that uses misinformation for their advantage. But when there's already mistrust that exists in fragile states between the people and their government, that's when terrorist groups come in. And so as we look at the fallout from COVID-19, we worry about online recruitment that's been going on, even as people have been inside. We know what violent Islamist extremism uses online propaganda to do, how they recruit from it. We had a hearing last year with the Counterterrorism Subcommittee on Homeland Security, where we looked at the transnational links between white supremacist space, where ties have been allowed to flourish without appropriate attention from law enforcement for years online. Again, all kinds of extremism, all kinds of terrorism online, and our counterterrorism efforts, and in this case, our global health efforts are interrelated, because we can only do so much. So in Syria, last point I'll make, in a place like Syria, where USAID spent so much time after an area is liberated working to teach local governance to function and to provide basic needs, that's why it's so critical that we continue to support this effort. And it's why, as much as we're suffering here at home, we just can't afford to turn away from these other countries, because whether it's Lebanon or Syria or Yemen or so many places around the world that are humanitarian challenges, if not outright disasters, it is these kinds of investments that help not only meet basic needs, but help prevent the spread of terrorism.
Great. Thank
Liz,
you.
can I add to something
Yeah.
to that? You know, and he's totally right. Ted's totally right. You know, adding to that too is that it's not like as if we pull back, everybody else does the same thing. And so not only do you have terrorist groups, as Ted mentioned, and you do, but you also have some state actors that are always looking to fill that void. And whether it's China or Russia or Iran, they're constantly probing to try to see where they can get in, where they can try to just put in a foothold, put in their tentacles. And they do that around the entire world, including in this hemisphere. So again, it is up to us to make sure that, as Ted said, that those weak states, that hopefully they can survive, and that we're the ones that they look to, and not Russia, not China, not Iran, because obviously those states are not doing it to be kind. They're doing it obviously for their national security interests, and most unfortunate, they see their national security interests as trying to hurt the United States. So again, we can't just pretend that we live in a vacuum, that if we just pull back from getting involved, that that's just the end of it. It isn't.
Can I ask you on this a little more?
Dynamic world.
There was a question in the chat about China. You're co-chair of the Taiwan caucus. You've been really outspoken about this. We're seeing China, even pre-COVID, they were Brazil's top trading partner over U.S. I saw this summer the Mexico foreign minister put out a tweet saying, "Thanks, China, for your unwavering support during this pandemic," with 3 exclamation points. I mean, they're all over the Southern Hemisphere. And how worried does that make you, in addition to the national security point you were just making, but from an economic point of view, given Florida is so dependent on our export market?
No, you're absolutely right. You mentioned Brazil. We were their #1 export partner. Now it's become China. I think China is potentially our greatest existential threat. It really is, not only because of their size, their economy, but the fact that they are very good at stealing intellectual property, stealing, cyber attacks on the United States. We now even see them doing cyber involvement, I don't want to call them attacks yet, but companies that are working on a vaccine to COVID. That's how aggressive and how nasty they can be. And they use their economic strength to try to get allies, to try to get their tentacles all over the world, including in this hemisphere. You mentioned Mexico. They're all over the place. They're even in the Bahamas, by the way. And so I think we have to take them a lot more seriously. We used to think, the United States, and I think the world used to think, that if we just kind of are nice to them and we invest and we spend money there, that they're going to become good guys. What has happened is that they've used, frankly, Western investment, U.S. investment, to strengthen their dictatorial regime. I think they're, again, the most dangerous, the most powerful, the wealthiest fascist dictatorship in the history of humanity. I shouldn't say maybe in the history, it's clearly the wealthiest and the largest in the history of humanity, and among the most dangerous. And so, they're an existential threat. And so I'm hoping that, by the way, this virus, which, by the way, comes from China, and they were clearly not transparent. They lied about it. Remember that while they were saying that it wasn't contagious, they closed down travel within China, but allowed Chinese to travel around the planet, kind of infecting Europe and the United States. And so that shouldn't surprise us. That's their nature. And we have to remember that. And I hope we learned the lessons, but I hope the world has learned lessons about this. When I saw that too, when the Mexican government said, "Oh, thank you, China, for your help in COVID," I wish they remembered COVID comes from China. They were clearly not transparent. They lied about it for months and months and months. And now I hope that the world and the United States will hold them accountable, not only for COVID, but for their human rights violations, for the way that they steal international intellectual property. We have to remember who we're dealing with and not have a kind of a rosy-eyed picture of a Chinese regime that is very dangerous, very violent, and who is very aggressive in expanding their territories and expanding their interests.
I want to bring in some of our Floridians for questions. One more question just to pick up on the economic piece of it. Congressman Deutch, as we were just talking about, Florida is so dependent on global connections, tourism, exports, which are obviously under enormous strain in during COVID. But Florida's business exports an astounding 56 billion goods last year alone. We're watching the U.S. exports down by 51% in key markets, Africa, South and Central America, compared to last year. And one of the things that we're watching closely, very worried about, is these emerging markets and what's happening, particularly because of COVID. How important are you seeing, do you feel, our economic recovery connected to the emerging markets and our export markets?
Well, at first, I want to just go back for 1 second and add one more thing, because it's related to this question, Liz, about China and about how we come through this here and what that means in the rest of the world. The Chinese, in addition to everything that Mario laid out, I heard time and time again in the conversations that I've had over the past number of months with ambassadors from around the world that the Chinese are always knocking at their doorstep, that they're looking for ways to be helpful, that they do so obviously without any expectations about or placed upon the countries, the governments, the type of political structures they have, because they don't share the same our values, the same commitment to democracy that we share. And the result is that there are those in those countries who are welcoming of the money, but also the opportunity to accept Chinese assistance and then walk back, if the United States is not fully engaged in the world, walk back from the commitments that we expect to democracy and human rights and freedom that has always been a hallmark of the United States. So that gets to this question of going forward and how these are related. If the United States, as the United States moves forward and we get through this, it's critical that we not view this as an economic challenge solely for the United States, because if we do, then it's a challenge around the rest of the world that will only become exacerbated. It's a challenge that will cause us to miss out on the opportunity to help the rest of the world rise, countries who should be there with us sharing our values, and it will lead to more instability around the world. So this is a multi-pronged approach, but we have to be focused on leading in the rest of the world, in the foreign assistance area, in the economic area, as we continue to move forward, because there's so much at stake for us. Again, not to keep beating this drum, but there's so much at stake for us, for our economy, but also for our national security.
Great. Let's bring in Brian Siegel from AJC, who's a member of our Florida Advisory Committee. Brian.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Congressman. It's great to see both of you. I want to reiterate what Liz said. Thank you for both really being models for bipartisanship and civility. I'm the director of the American Jewish Committee for South Florida and a proud member of USGLC's Florida Advisory Board. I've seen firsthand in my many visits to Europe, Israel, and other parts of the world how America's support for our allies and strategic partners pay off in dividends by creating new markets and building a safer world. You've both been ardent defenders of development and diplomacy and supporters of Israel and other long-standing critical allies. During times of international crisis, like the current coronavirus pandemic, why is it so critical that the United States stay engaged globally and coordinate with our allies overseas, not only to protect those most vulnerable, but our own citizens?
Great question. Thank you, Brian. Congressman Deutch, why don't you start that one off?
Sure. Well, it's good to see you too, Brian, by the way. And as we've seen as we've gone through this. We're reminded of how interconnected the world is, and it's imperative that we recognize, as Mario points out, that this is not a situation where if we choose to stop engaging in the world, if we choose to stop supporting our allies, if we choose to cut off assistance and fail to recognize the national security role that our assistance provides, then there are others waiting to step in. And so we've seen we've seen the role that USAID plays. We've seen USAID using things like enterprise funds to the private sector to help bolster small and medium-sized businesses. I think that as we go forward, the opportunity to recognize both foreign assistance directly and the role that USAID plays to help economies grow and to help economies come through this. The Development Finance Corporation that recently created, that combines the OPIC and the Development Credit Authority at USAID. So we have an entire institution now focused on bringing together the private sector and the work of the government to help work with our allies and recognize that support for allies is so critical, and implementing partners around the world like the Catholic Relief Services, who leverage USAID funding and charitable funding in places where perhaps the United States can't get in, can't do the work on the ground. Like in the West Bank and Gaza, for example, Catholic Relief Services is implementing $5 million in COVID assistance in the West Bank now, and using other funding sources where the U.S. isn't currently providing funding. All of that, though, because of the work in bringing together assistance from the government, direct assistance from the government, from the United States to our allies and to groups who are helping to foster democracy and women's rights and economic opportunity around the world, but also partnering with the private sector and partnering with these charitable organizations that help, again, not only stand with our allies to benefit them, but to help them understand why America continues to be and will continue to be a leader in advancing not just the well-being of these countries, but the values that we all care so deeply about.
Great, that's great. Congressman Diaz-Balart, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and Brian, good to see you. I hope you're well, and again, thanks for your leadership. Look, just very simple. I agree with what Ted said, but I also think it's important that, again, as Ted reiterated, that we can't just leave, because it's not like the world stops spinning, right? Bad things would happen if we, and we've done that from time to time in our history. We've pulled back. Liz, at the beginning, you mentioned that. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, we thought, oh, great, we don't have to be as involved, and that was not a good idea. Israel is a good example of what happens when you have alliances, strong alliances. And I guess, Brian, you called it what, paying dividends. We've gotten so many dividends from that relationship, that very close, special relationship with Israel. And that means, and I kind of talked about this, I alluded to this before, the United States has to always remember, wishful thinking is not good foreign policy, and so therefore we have to remember who our allies are, stand by our allies. I know that there were many who thought that when the United States finally moved our embassy to the capital of Israel, that the world was going to fall apart. And what have we seen? No, that the world has seen that the United States stands with Israel, that's a real strong relationship. Now we're seeing other Middle Eastern countries, signing peace deals with Israel, and again, that requires U.S. leadership. We're also seeing now other countries who have moved their embassy to Jerusalem. Not the end of the world. So again, U.S. leadership is so important, and that involves, and it requires the U.S. not having this false narrative that somehow helping our enemies helps our national interest. Confronting our enemies, like Iran, in the Middle East, like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua in this hemisphere, and standing with our allies is frankly foreign policy, which is what keeps us safe and keeps our allies safe, keeps them strong. And we've seen dividends with that relationship with Israel, and we've seen it very dramatically with what's going on right now in the Middle East. And I want to end on this part about saying how Israel is also on the forefront of fighting COVID and working with the United States on whether it's vaccine developments and other things. Again, paying huge dividends, like it's done for our national security, for our defense. It is also doing the same thing with healthcare, that special relationship with Israel.
Great, thank you. Let's take a question from Leanne Ventura from the Greater Miami Chamber.
Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts. I wholeheartedly agree with you and with Liz on everything. As a matter of fact, just before COVID, I got back from Argentina and then China. And so I know what you're talking about. As our nation continues to combat COVID-19 around the world, there's no doubt that the resources, expertise, and technology of US and Florida companies will be critical to our government. How do these public-private partnerships leverage the strengths of both the public and private?
Oh no.
Oh, we lost her.
Oh, he froze.
Oh, no.
I think it's on public-private partnership as I got the sense of it. So how do those work? I'll finish your question, but I think it was on the role of kind of public-private partnership, but particularly the private sector. And I think, Ted, you were talking a little bit about that on the previous question. So any further thoughts that you have about how do you leverage, government to kind of get it to scale with the private sector?
Well, Liz, I'll actually defer to Mario.
Okay.
Because one, I like to hear his thoughts, and two, there's this really loud noise right outside, so I'm going to pause.
Okay, so I'll come back to you on another question. I got a couple questions for you. So Congressman, how do you get the private sector working with, there's a lot of that. I mean, it used to be, I can remember times when it was all through like kind of the corporate responsibility lens, and that's not what it is now. It is a really serious public-private partnership at a scale I've never seen before. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it has to be, you can't just assume that government alone is going to be able to solve the issues. And so it is crucial to get, not only because of their expertise, the private sector's expertise, their involvement, but around the world, it's also to help them build that infrastructure, because the goal of spending around the planet, obviously we've talked a lot about how it's a national security, it's national security spending in the United States, but the goal is not to have to do this forever. It's to build up those allies, those countries, those infrastructures, so that we can pull out of there, not pull out of there because we just give up, pull out because the infrastructure is developed, because they have the infrastructure to continue to grow, to do so safely, to walk on their own. And so obviously public-private partnerships in the United States, you're seeing that in a very dramatic way on this, you call it the Operation Warp Speed, which is the largest scientific mobilization probably since the Apollo program. But it's important to do that around the world as well, to build up those economies so that, again, they don't become dependent. We don't want them to become, other countries to become dependent on U.S. assistance, on U.S. money. We want to build them up so they can do it on their own. That obviously is the goal, not to just keep having to put money into overseas spending. Ideally, we wouldn't have to spend any money abroad, but we do. And with these public-private partnerships, not only is it more effective, more efficient, but you build up that infrastructure so that hopefully we can start pulling back and pulling out. And we've done so in some examples where we don't have to spend as much money because it's been successful. Best case we already talked about, I think, in recent years is Plan Colombia. Best example.
Let me switch to
Liz, can I just add one?
You're back.
Now that I can hear myself think, I wanted to just add one word to this, which is the private sector understands, particularly companies who are engaged globally, which more and more is everyone. And the private sector understands the global economy is so interconnected that stability in markets is dependent on geopolitics.
Yeah.
And the private sector can help create opportunities that strengthen markets and thereby increase stability, at the same time that the United States government can work to help create stability on the ground through its support of democracy building and market building and the other things that we do to help provide basic services. So that's one way. Another way I think that
No, these themes just really fit together. But I want to ask each of you to pick. I'm going to put one question to each of you that are two issues that are really challenging. Refugees for Congressman Diaz-Balart, climate change to Congressman Deutch. On refugees, you are co-chair of the Bipartisan Refugee Caucus. There are right now 25 million refugees living in cramped, unhygienic camps with no access to social distancing or water, this perfect storm for disease transmission. Alarming that there's confirmed now COVID cases is one of the biggest Syrian refugee camps. How concerned are you about the humanitarian crisis of some of the most vulnerable communities on the planet? Congressman Diaz-Balart.
Look, Liz, it's no secret that refugees are always vulnerable, right? And now with this added issue of COVID, it's even frankly more dangerous for them. And first, the United States has a longstanding tradition of solidarity with those who are oppressed, folks who are looking for freedom, those who are suffering, and that's who we are, and it's something I'm very proud of. So that's why I think we always have to do what we can to help folks across the world. And also now we're seeing, and we've seen it before, whether it's Zika or Ebola or obviously this pandemic, that you can't just assume that because it's far away that it's not going to happen here. And so, no, it is worrisome. I think the United States has the responsibility to lead there. The United States are amazing. The people of the United States are amazingly generous. Yeah. And that's something that, again, that I'm very proud of. And so as tough as it has been for those who are, fleeing oppression, those who are dealing with instability, with other circumstances, right now with this pandemic, it is even more difficult for them. And I will repeat, and again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but we do this not only to help folks abroad, but for our national security interests. And the days that we can think that if it's a disease that it's far away, that, well, it won't get here. And I remember early on, there was a lot of objection to when the United States, and I think, again, another one of the huge success stories is what the United States, our leadership, started under President Bush, was fighting AIDS in Africa. And yes, we've saved millions and millions of lives in Africa, but that also affects us here because people travel, because people move around, and you're seeing this with this pandemic. We have a responsibility. I'm exceedingly concerned, but I'm also really, really proud that Congress, in a bipartisan way, we worked very, very closely together to not forget that while we're struggling here and while we've had to spend a lot of money, by the way, Liz, all of it borrowed money, and so, it's going to have long-term consequences for us. We have not forgotten to do what we need to do abroad, spending what we can abroad, not only on national security spending, on Department of State spending, on foreign aid and education, but also on helping refugees. I'm hoping that's a responsibility that the U.S. never goes back on, and I will continue to do what I can to make sure the United States leads on that effort, and Ted has always been
I know both of you have.
And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you for both of your leadership on that. I want to get a question in on climate change. Miami has been called the most vulnerable coastal city in the world, threatened obviously by extreme weather, sea levels rising. There are similar challenges in the rest of the world. By 2050, it is thought that 300 million people in coastal areas will be threatened by dangerous floods. So Congressman Deutch, talk about why America leadership is so critical in this arena. You have been out there on this issue as well, particularly talking about the disproportionate in the developing world, just a continuation of this conversation.
It's a really critically important issue that America needs to lead on. I appreciate the question. I'm going to take just a few seconds to comment on refugees.
I knew I couldn't stop you.
just a few. And again, there was a time not that long ago where we could just you know, and Mario and I still live in this time, but where the rest of the country could have honest conversations about these issues and how we're going to confront them. And so I just offer as a genuinely honest and concerned critique that at a time when there are more than 25 million refugees in the world, and America has long been known for its humanitarianism and its willingness to provide a haven for refugees, that it's the wrong time to reduce the refugee cap to 15,000 to the lowest that it's ever been. And I'm we're circulating a letter now in Congress to focus on the issue of the Uyghurs and for example, and to encourage the Secretary of State to do more to provide visas for Uyghurs who the Chinese government are putting into concentration camps. So I think that needs to be an important part of the conversation as well. On climate change, I don't represent Miami. I do, however, represent Fort Lauderdale. And if Miami has been called the most vulnerable, then I would imagine Fort Lauderdale is also near the top of that list.
Right on the heel.
Sea level rise is not a political issue. In climate change and sea level rise is not a political issue in Fort Lauderdale. It's not in Miami either. It's not in South Florida at all, where the local governments have come together, recognizing the challenges to our economy that we will face long term if we don't seriously confront this. That's why our former colleague Carlos Cabral and I started the Climate Solutions Caucus that aims to look for real and actionable items that Congress can undertake. And national security is one that has been near the top of the list. We've spent time with national security officials who have told us their concerns. Even if you look at the Arctic Circle, for example, you look where Russia is trying to make a major play for influence. It's just one example of where American leadership is really critical. We have to lead in confronting climate change because of what it does, the threat it poses to our national security, the threat it poses to our economy, and because American leadership is critical to these battles. And so, when I hope that we'll revisit the decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, I think that we're in a unique position as the United States to advance these arguments from a leadership position, from a position of strength. And like everything else we've been talking about, if we're not engaged, others are there looking to fill the gap. And so we know that droughts create food insecurity and water crises. We know that that's destabilizing. We know that leads to instability and war. We know about the huge number of climate refugees that we're expected to see if we don't confront this. So from Nigeria to Jordan to all around the world, the United States has to work to protect our own interests by confronting climate change and being a global leader at doing so.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question from our Floridians. Lanier Robbins, a consultant to Global Ties.
Thank you so much, Liz, and good afternoon, Congressman Deutch and Congressman Diaz-Balart. In the work that I do as an international relations consultant with organizations such as Global Ties Miami, where the importance of cultural and educational exchanges are highly valued, as well as with the British American Business Council of Miami, where creating transatlantic business and trade relationships and opportunities are important for our local economy. COVID-19 has greatly affected global travel. An area involving global travel that I would like to highlight is how the pandemic is leading to a decline in international students coming to Florida. Florida receives 46,000 international students each year. These students not only help connect our state with the world around us, but also contributes over $1.6 billion to our economy. And this question is for the two of you. How do we ensure that international students, as well as business and leisure travelers, come back to Florida after the pandemic? Thank you both very much.
That's an important one. Congressman Deutch, you want to kick that off?
Sure. Look, international students we know have, like so many others, have been in limbo because of travel restrictions and embassy closures, consulates, and unclear visa policies. The goal, I think, always needs to be to bring the best and the brightest minds to this country for their education, to show what America has to offer and to teach and instill American values. And I think we have to make sure that universities have plans in place that will allow international students to continue their education virtually if need be, so that they can maintain continuity in their studies. And I think there need to be plans for what happens if travel restrictions are lifted and reimposed, so students don't wind up scrambling as they did back in March. I think there needs to be clear guidance, immigration guidance, and State Department has to have the funding necessary to do this. And all of this, again, gets to the question of values, making sure that we have people here students here who will benefit the United States, both in the short term, in what they're learning from our universities, and in the long term from those who ultimately wind up staying and contributing to our economy as well.
If I can, maybe I will take the privilege of the moderator to ask a last question to both of you, which is, this has probably been one of my most favorite. I moderate a lot of these all over the country, now all over the Zoom world, and you can go to multiple states on the same day, which is actually kind of fun. But it is one of my most favorite because I love the bipartisan spirit. And you both have so much knowledge about the world and about why it is important that we engage. And I know you are both optimists, and I love that spirit that both of you have. And I would love you to share what gives you hope that we will rise to this challenge, as difficult as this last 6 months have been for your constituents, the country at large, the world at large, that particularly that America will be and can be that force for good in the world, because it's both the right thing and the smart thing to do. Congressman Diaz-Balart, if you would start.
Well, thanks, Liz. And by the way, we don't agree on everything.
I know that.
I don't agree with him. Right, for the record, I don't agree with him on going back to the Paris Accords. I think the world should go to the American model, where we're the only ones that actually would be, all those that signed the Paris Accord, by the way, are not in compliance. We are in compliance because we didn't get into it, because we got out of the Paris Accord. But even where we disagree, and this is the key, is that we get together and we work it out. And we do so because we trust each other, and the most important thing is trust and knowing that somebody, whether you agree or disagree with them, is doing it for the right reasons. And that's why I love working with Ted. And so thanks, Liz, for bringing us together. Why am I optimistic? Because this is the greatest country that God has allowed men and women to build on this planet in the history of humanity. Because we're seeing we talked about public and private partnerships. We're seeing the largest mobilization of government and of the private sector since the Apollo program in order to get not only cures but vaccines. And I think that's going to happen. And obviously we get pretty regular information as to how that's moving forward. And I'm optimistic that the United States will not only have a vaccine and cures for our people, but we'll be able to spread that around the planet and show the planet what the United States can do. I'm optimistic because freedom always prevails, and the American people who are struggling have been through tough times, and we've always prevailed. We've always gotten through it, and we're going to get through this as well. And again, it requires government, private sector. But the biggest treasure that we have in this country is not the government or even the private sector. It's the American people. It's that attitude of, go get it. We're going to get this thing done. We're going to solve it. And, elections are coming up, and we'll be divided, or we'll be saying horrible things about each other. But ultimately, we get together as one, with no hatred, with no bickering, and that's how we get things done. And I think an example of that is the relationship that I have with Ted. Yes, Ted and I are friends, but it's a relationship of trust. And again, even where we disagree, we figure out ways to kind of like put that aside and find solutions. And that's the only way that that things happen, is if you're willing to just roll up your sleeves, stop the bickering, find solutions. that is what has made this country an amazing place, and that's why I'm so optimistic.
Hear, hear. Congressman Deutch.
I completely agree. If there is one thing that gives me hope every day, it's the resilience of the American people. We talk to people. Mario and I have the privilege, among the many privileges we have in doing this job, of talking to people from all walks of life, and whatever they do, and especially during this pandemic, whether there are people on the front lines who are putting their lives at risk to help save the lives of others, to help us continue to move forward. Businesses that have struggled as they've done whatever they thought they needed to do to try to get through this and help ensure that their employees could continue to get through this with them. The first responders, I mean, they're in every walk of life. We've been so inspired. I've been so inspired by what I've seen, the number of people who have stepped up to help their neighbors who are in need of food or other assistance, the number of people who started making masks because they knew that they were needed at their hospital, or they knew that they were needed at their grocery stores, and they just started doing it. There was a time, Liz, I'll just finish with this. There was a time early on in this pandemic when everyone felt and knew and felt like we were all in this together, and they were right. And somehow there have been fractures, and things that shouldn't be political became political. But deep down, there is that sense that we're all in this together. And I started doing this Facebook Live early on in the pandemic just to try to be in contact with my constituents. And we do every day. We finish with a little bit of good news, the inspirational stories from people around the community and around the country who have stepped up, kids, teachers, seniors, people who have stepped up just to try to help one another get through this. And that's what's so inspiring, and that's what gives me hope. And Mario's right. We find ways to work together, and we're in the home stretch, and this campaign is no doubt gonna have nasty moments, but there are more of us than there aren't who realize that ultimately, once this election is over, we have no choice but to come together again and rely upon one another to get through this together, because that's what's necessary. That's the way we've always done this, because that's who we are as Americans.
What a fabulous conversation. Thank you to Congressman Deutch, Congressman Diaz-Balart, for your leadership, your voice, and for sharing your wisdom and your inspiration with us today. Thank you to all of you for joining us for the conversation. Follow us on Twitter for more. Follow them as well so you can hear this inspiration they brought to us today. And if you're not getting our updates, let us know. We look forward to being part of the conversation with all of you. Have a great day, stay safe, and we will continue more of this and these conversations as we go forward. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.